In the fading glow of a cold October evening, the silhouette of Blackwood Manor stands starkly against the darkening sky. Beneath the weight of decades of neglect, its once grand and imposing Victorian architecture now seems to visibly slump. Slowly panning across the overgrown grounds, the camera captures crumbling stone cherubs whose frozen smiles once welcomed visitors, and twisted iron gates that now hang useless. The drone shot gradually descends, weaving through skeletal tree branches. Their leaves long ago surrendered to autumn winds that whisper through the property like the breath of ghosts. The camera pauses on a small weathered sign, partially obscured by ivy. Winslow House for Children, EST 1897. Perched at the top of the sign, a raven lands, its obsidian eyes appearing to stare directly into the lens before taking flight again, drawing our gaze toward the mansion's broken windows. Dark eyes watching from a forgotten face. A gentle female voice begins to narrate. Her tone is measured but carries an underlying unease that seems to mirror the disturbing visuals perfectly. The story of the Winslow family and their chain of orphanages begins like so many tales of apparent philanthropy from America's Gilded Age. A wealthy industrialist family, flush with proceeds from the railroad boom, decided to give back to society by providing homes for the nation's most vulnerable children. Yet beneath this veneer of charity lies one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the early 20th century. For over 100 years, like so many of its victims, this mystery has remained buried. The image shifts to sepia-toned photographs of a distinguished-looking family gathered on the steps of a mansion. At the center stands a tall, austere man with a thick mustache, his posture militarily straight, one hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a woman seated before him. Even through the formal stiffness of Victorian photography, her beauty is evident: high cheekbones, clear eyes that seem to hold secrets, and a mouth that doesn't quite form the expected demure smile of the era. Arranged around them like chess pieces on a board controlled by invisible hands, 3 children in formal attire stand. During America's rapid industrialization, Theodore Winslow built his fortune in steel and railways. The narrator continues as documents showing stock certificates and newspaper clippings about railway expansions appear on screen. Born in 1855 to modest means, Winslow displayed an almost preternatural talent for identifying business opportunities. During the economic panic of 1873, while other investors retreated, he acquired struggling steel mills at fractions of their value. When the economy recovered, his holdings positioned him perfectly to capitalize on the railway boom that would transform America. Vintage footage of steam locomotives and workers laying tracks across vast landscapes fills the screen. The physical manifestation of America's manifest destiny, rendered in iron and sweat. By 1895, with a personal fortune that would be worth billions in today's money, Theodore was one of the wealthiest men in New England. A man who had started with nothing had risen to join the ranks of the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Vanderbilts, America's new aristocracy, built not on bloodlines, but on industry and ruthless ambition. The image transitions to a portrait of Eleanor Winslow, the same woman from the family photograph, but captured alone, her gaze direct and unsettling in its intensity. His wife Eleanor came from a completely different world. Born Eleanor Blackwood, she was the last descendant of one of Boston's oldest families, a lineage tracing back to the Mayflower, but whose fortune had dwindled over generations. Their marriage in 1879 represented the classic American merger of Old World prestige and New World wealth. While Theodore built his empire, Eleanor established herself as a woman of unusual intellect and interests. She was known for her social conscience, unusual among the elite of that time, but also for her fascination with the emerging sciences of human development and heredity. Alongside photographs of Eleanor attending scientific lectures and medical demonstrations, the screen displays her portrait. A woman in elegant Victorian dress, somehow appearing not out of place among men in academic robes. The camera slowly zooms in on Eleanor Winslow's face. Despite the formal stiffness of Victorian photography, there's something in her eyes, a certain intensity that seems to pierce through the decades, challenging the viewer to understand what drove her. She doesn't look like a monster. And perhaps that's the most disturbing revelation, that someone who appears so normal, so human could orchestrate what was to come. Unprecedented in scale, what followed was. The narrator continues as a map of the northeastern United States displays on screen. One by one, pins appear, marking the locations of each new orphanage. Over the next 15 years, the Winslow Charitable Foundation would establish 12 orphanages across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. From Maine to Maryland, the name Winslow became synonymous with progressive care for orphan children. The camera pans across architects' renderings and construction photographs showing the building of each institution, imposing brick and stone structures rising from cleared land, hundreds of workers swarming over scaffolding. Made manifest in mortar and stone, the Winslow fortune. Lavishly funded, each facility was architecturally impressive and staffed by professionals handpicked by the Winslows themselves. Unlike the overcrowded, underfunded state orphanages of the era, Winslow homes featured private rooms, modern plumbing, electric lighting, and educational facilities that rivaled the finest private schools. The family's generosity was praised by newspapers of the era, holding them up as exemplars of how America's new wealthy class should behave. The contrast with other child care institutions of the time couldn't have been more striking, says a new expert appearing on screen, identified as Dr. Amelia Richardson, historian of American social welfare. This was the era before child labor laws, before meaningful regulation of orphanages, Dr. Richardson explains, seated in a book-lined office. Many institutions of the time were little more than workhouses where children as young as 6 were expected to contribute through labor. Mortality rates of 30 to 40% were not uncommon due to disease, malnutrition, and neglect. Against this backdrop, the Winslow orphanages seemed like paradise. Children were well-fed, well-clothed, educated, and apparently healthy. Newspaper headlines from the early 1900s fill the screen. Winslow opens 6th home for orphan children. Millionaire's charity transforms lives. Eleanor Winslow, America's Angel of Mercy. The press coverage was glowing, almost reverent. The Winslows were masters at controlling their public image, Dr. Richardson continues. They regularly invited journalists to tour their facilities, always carefully choreographed visits to specific areas, always featuring the same group of healthy, articulate children who would speak glowingly of their treatment. In retrospect, we can see these were essentially Potemkin orphanages, showcasing a false reality that masked the truth of what was happening in areas visitors never saw. Lurking behind these glowing headlines, however, was a disturbing reality that wouldn't come to light until decades later. The narrator's voice grows more somber as the music shifts to a minor key. Records indicate that between 1897 and 1912, over 3,000 children passed through the doors of Winslow orphanages. They came from all backgrounds. Children orphaned by industrial accidents, by disease, by poverty. Children surrendered by desperate parents during economic downturns. Immigrant children whose parents had died during the journey to America or shortly after arrival. Intake photographs appear on screen, row after row of solemn young faces, each with a number pinned to their clothing, their expressions ranging from fear to resignation to defiance. Of those 3,000 children, the narrator continues, her voice now barely above a whisper. Not a single one can be definitively traced after entering the system. The music shifts, growing tense and discordant as the screen freezes on the children's faces. One by one, each photograph slowly fades to black until the screen is dark. No adoption records, no death certificates, no census entries, no marriage licenses, no military service records, no property deeds, nothing. It's as if these 3,000 children simply vanished. The darkness gives way to a modern-day shot of an elderly woman seated in a comfortable living room, surrounded by books, papers, and a laptop computer. A face lined with age is framed by silver hair, but animated by intelligence and intensity. A caption identifies her as Dr. Margaret Holbrook, historian, author of America's Missing, The Winslow Orphanage Mystery. What makes this disappearance so extraordinary is its scope, Dr. Holbrook explains, leaning forward with intensity. We're not talking about a few missing records or clerical errors. We're not talking about children who fell through administrative cracks or who changed their names and couldn't be traced. We're talking about thousands of children who entered these institutions and then vanished completely from the historical record. She rises and walks to a wall covered in photographs and documents. Laid bare in a visual web of connections and questions, her research. I've spent 30 years studying historical disappearances and unexplained events, she continues, gesturing to the wall. The closest parallel might be the lost colony of Roanoke, but that involved only about 115 people. Nothing on this scale has been documented before or since in American history. And what makes it even more remarkable is how thoroughly these disappearances were concealed from public awareness for over a century. Picking up a photograph of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, in early 20th century clothing, Dr. Holbrook continues. This is Robert Campbell, admitted to the Winslow home in Portland, Maine in 1902. He was orphaned after his parents died in a factory fire. His intake records note that he was in excellent health, scored above average on educational assessments, and was described as good-natured and compliant. 6 months after this photograph was taken, he was recorded as having been transferred to another facility for specialized education, a common notation in Winslow records. No such transfer can be verified. No further record of Robert Campbell exists anywhere. She replaces the photograph and picks up another. A teenage girl with serious eyes. Catherine Donahue, age 14, admitted in 1905. Parents died of tuberculosis, noted as exceptionally intelligent and suitable for advanced studies. Disappeared 8 weeks after admission. Alice Jenkins, age 6, admitted 1908. She continues, each photograph representing another lost child, another life erased from history. The scene transitions to a small-town library where a middle-aged man with glasses carefully handles old leather-bound record books in a climate-controlled room. Filing cabinets and archival boxes fill the space, a repository of local history preserved with evident care. The caption reads, James Porter, Millfield Historical Society. What makes this case so frustrating is how meticulous the initial documentation was, Porter says, turning pages of neat handwritten entries. Every child who entered a Winslow orphanage was photographed, measured, and had their biographical details recorded in extraordinary detail. Their names, birthplaces, circumstances of their orphaning, medical histories, educational assessments, all preserved with remarkable care. He points to specific entries, precise handwriting documenting heights, weights, vaccination records, dental examinations, even cranial measurements alongside the personal histories of each child. The level of detail goes far beyond what was standard practice for orphanages of the era. He continues, it resembles scientific documentation more than social welfare record-keeping. Each child was assigned a unique identification number that followed them through the system. They were regularly examined and assessed with detailed notes on their physical and mental development. And then nothing, no records of where they went afterward. Porter carefully closes the book and removes his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully before continuing. In normal circumstances, there would be discharge records, adoptions, transfers to other institutions, employment placements for older children, or death certificates for those who succumb to illness. Every child would have a documented outcome. But in the Winslow system, these records simply stop. It's as if they created this elaborate system to track these children for some purpose other than their welfare. And once that purpose was fulfilled, the children ceased to matter. The camera pans across rows of these intake records, each containing photographs and personal details of children aged from infancy to adolescence. Page after page of lives documented and then abandoned. If not for one determined genealogist's search for her great-grandfather in 2010, the mystery might have remained buried forever. The narrator continues, Catherine Reeves was tracing her family history when she discovered that her great-grandfather, William Reeves, had been placed in the Winslow home for boys in Philadelphia in 1903 at age 7. Despite extensive searching, however, she could find no record of what happened to him after his admission. This led her to connect with other genealogists and historians who soon uncovered the same pattern across all 12 Winslow institutions. The scene shifts to a middle-aged woman with auburn hair seated at a computer surrounded by family photographs and documents. A caption identifies her, Catherine Reeves, genealogist. I just wanted to know what happened to my great-grandfather, she says, her voice thick with emotion. I never expected to uncover something of this magnitude. The more I looked, the more I realized that every child who went into these orphanages simply disappeared from record. It defies explanation. The screen transitions to show a map of the northeastern United States with 12 points illuminated to show the locations of the Winslow orphanages stretching from Maine to Maryland. To understand this mystery, we need to examine the Winslow family more closely. The narrator continues. Theodore and Eleanor had 3 children. Frederick, the eldest, born in 1880, Victoria, born in 1883, and Charles, the youngest, born in 1885. As they're mentioned, formal portraits of each child appear on screen. By all accounts, they were raised in extraordinary privilege, educated by private tutors before attending prestigious universities. Frederick studied at Harvard, Victoria at Radcliffe, one of the few institutions offering higher education to women at that time, and Charles at Yale. They were being groomed to take over not just the family's business interests, but also their charitable foundation. The scene shifts to another historian, a younger man standing in front of an imposing university building. The caption reads, Dr. Robert Chen, Professor of American History, Harvard University. What's particularly interesting about the Winslow children is how completely they embraced their parents' philanthropic mission. Dr. Chen explains, in an era when many wealthy heirs were known primarily for their extravagance and social escapades, the younger Winslows were actively involved in the orphanages. There are numerous accounts of them visiting the institutions, overseeing operations, even personally interviewing potential staff members. This wasn't charity at arm's length. The camera pans across photographs showing well-dressed young adults, presumably the Winslow children, interacting with groups of orphans in formal settings. The first hint that something might be amiss came in 1908. The narrator continues as the scene shifts to show a yellowed newspaper clipping. A local doctor in Baltimore near the site of one of the orphanages wrote a letter to the health department expressing concern about the number of children he was told had died of tuberculosis at the Winslow home. Dr. James Morrison requested an inspection, noting that the reported mortality rate seemed unusually high. The camera zooms in on a paragraph in the letter. Having been informed of no fewer than 14 deaths in the past month alone, a figure which strikes me as statistically improbable, even accounting for the present epidemic. What happened next set a pattern that would repeat whenever questions arose about the Winslow orphanages. Within 2 weeks of sending his letter, Dr. Morrison received a visit from Charles Winslow himself, accompanied by 2 representatives from the Baltimore Health Department. They presented him with detailed medical records documenting each case, complete with death certificates signed by the orphanage's resident physician, Dr. Edwin Porter. The screen shows replicas of these medical records and death certificates, all bearing the same physician's signature. Dr. Morrison later reported being satisfied with the explanation, even impressed by the thoroughness of the orphanage's medical protocols. He withdrew his complaint. The camera returns to Dr. Holbrook in her living room. This is where things get truly strange, she says, shaking her head slightly. Because when my research team tried to locate these children's burial records or death certificates in Maryland State Archives, they simply weren't there. The copies shown to Dr. Morrison were never officially filed with the state. And Dr. Edwin Porter, the physician who supposedly signed these certificates. We can find no record that such a doctor was ever licensed to practice in Maryland or any other state for that matter. The music grows more ominous as the camera pans across old photographs of the Baltimore orphanage, lingering on the faces of children who would soon vanish from history. Similar incidents occurred in Connecticut in 1909 and Massachusetts in 1910. The narrator continues, local concerns about missing children or unusual activities at the orphanages were always met with the same response. A personal visit from a member of the Winslow family, accompanied by seemingly impeccable documentation and often a generous donation to local civic causes. In each case, the inquiries were dropped. The scene transitions to an old photograph of a group of well-dressed men seated around a formal dining table. The Winslows weren't just wealthy, they were connected. Theodore Winslow regularly hosted senators, judges, and police commissioners at his estate. His annual hunting retreats were attended by some of the most powerful men in America. When the Winslow family wanted something handled discreetly, they had the influence to make it happen. The camera pans to show a weathered journal open to reveal handwritten entries. In 1911, a nurse named Sarah Mitchell began working at the Winslow home in Providence, Rhode Island. Unusual among the staff, she hadn't been personally selected by the family, but was brought in temporarily during a scarlet fever outbreak. During her 3 months of employment, she kept a journal that provides one of the few insider accounts of life within a Winslow orphanage. The camera shows pages from the journal as a different female voice reads excerpts. April 14, 1911. Arrived at Winslow home today. Building is impressive, far better appointed than any hospital I've worked in. Children seem well fed and clothed. Staff very formal, almost excessively so. Matron Mrs. Winters watched me constantly throughout orientation. April 27, 1911. Something odd today. 3 children were taken to the East Wing for special examinations by Dr. Lambert. When I offered to assist, I was firmly told my help wasn't needed. Children didn't return to their dormitories tonight. May 2, 1911. Asked Mrs. Winters about the 3 children. Told they had been transferred to the Winslow home in Boston where treatment for their condition is more advanced. No mention of this possibility had been made to me when they were taken for examinations. May 18, 1911. More children taken to East Wing. 5 this time, always the healthiest ones, which seems strange if they require special medical attention. June 3, 1911. Mentioned my concerns to Dr. Lambert today about the transferring of children without proper documentation. He became quite agitated. Said all paperwork was handled at the administrative level and that my focus should remain on the scarlet fever cases. Later found Mrs. Winters going through my personal belongings in the staff quarters. June 10, 1911. Something is very wrong here. Counted beds in dormitories. 17 children have disappeared since my arrival. All supposedly transferred. No new children have arrived despite Mrs. Winters mentioning expected new admissions several times. Tomorrow I intend to. The journal entries end abruptly as the narrator's voice returns. Sarah Mitchell's journal contains no final entry. According to employment records, without notice, she left the orphanage the following day, June 11, 1911. No further record of Sarah Mitchell exists. No census entries, no marriage certificate, no death certificate. Like the children she had become concerned about, she simply vanished. The scene transitions to a modern police station where a serious-looking detective examines old files. The caption identifies him, Detective Michael Torres, Cold Case Unit, Rhode Island State Police. We reopened an investigation into the Winslow Orphanages in 2015 after Dr. Holbrook's book brought national attention to the case. Detective Torres explains, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to certain crimes, including murder, and the scale of the disappearances certainly warranted a fresh look. What we found, or rather, what we didn't find, was disturbing. He gestures to the files in front of him. In normal circumstances, even from a century ago, we would expect to find some paper trail, death certificates, adoption records, transfer documentation between institutions. But it's as if someone systematically removed every trace of these children from official records. And not just the children. Dozens of staff members seem to have disappeared as well. The thoroughness of it suggests resources and influence that go well beyond what even a wealthy family should have been able to accomplish. The camera pans across photographs of the 12 Winslow orphanages in their prime, imposing brick and stone structures with manicured grounds. Between 1897 and 1912, the Winslow Charitable Foundation spent the equivalent of over $400 million in today's money building and operating their orphanages, the narrator explains. An astronomical sum for charitable work in that era. Where did all that money really go? And what actually happened within those walls? The scene shifts to show architectural plans and blueprints of the orphanages. One disturbing clue comes from examining the original architectural plans for the orphanages. The narrator continues. In 2017, a research team from Boston University managed to locate the complete blueprints for 5 of the 12 institutions. What they found has disturbing implications. The camera zooms in on sections of the blueprints as a new expert begins to speak. The caption reads, Dr. Elena Vasquez, architectural historian, Boston University. These buildings were designed with features that seem puzzling for orphanages, Dr. Vasquez explains, pointing to specific areas of the blueprints: extensive basement levels with unusual reinforcement, separate water and electrical systems for different wings, oversized furnace rooms, and in 3 of the 5 sets of plans we examined, there were hidden passages connecting the administrative areas to the children's dormitories, passages not visible from the main corridors. She looks directly at the camera, her expression grave. Most concerning were the modifications made to the original designs. In every case, the plans were altered to add more extensive basement facilities after construction had already begun. At considerable additional expense, Theodore Winslow personally approved these changes. The music becomes more intense as the camera pans across old photographs of basement doorways and corridors. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from the final days of the Winslow orphanage system. The narrator says in June 1912, a fire broke out at the Winslow home in Hartford, Connecticut. In the middle of the night, the blaze began and spread with unusual speed. By morning, the building was completely destroyed. Historical photographs of the aftermath of the fire fill the screen. Blackened ruins, firefighters, and onlookers gathered around the smoldering remains. Official reports listed 17 casualties, 12 children, and 5 staff members. However, admission records indicated that 73 children should have been resident at the time along with 22 staff. The discrepancy was explained by a statement from Victoria Winslow, who told authorities that the majority of children and staff had been evacuated the previous day due to planned renovations. The camera zooms in on a newspaper photograph of Victoria Winslow speaking with officials at the fire scene. Her face composed, but her posture rigid. No documentation of this evacuation was ever produced. No one came forward to confirm having received the transferred children or staff. Once again, dozens of people had vanished without trace. The scene transitions to show headlines from the summer of 1912. Second Winslow orphanage burns in mysterious blaze. Fire destroys Philadelphia Winslow home. Investigation launched. Third Winslow orphanage lost to fire. Arson suspected. Within 2 months of the Hartford fire, 3 more Winslow orphanages were destroyed by fire. In each case, the official death toll was surprisingly low, with the Winslow family claiming that most residents had been transferred before the blazes. By September 1912, the remaining 8 orphanages had been hastily closed, with all children supposedly transferred to other institutions. The camera shows a formal portrait of Theodore Winslow in his later years, his expression stern and unreadable. Theodore Winslow died of a stroke in October 1912, just weeks after the closure of the final orphanage. Senators, a Supreme Court justice, and even the Vice President of the United States attended his funeral. Newspaper eulogies praised his philanthropic legacy, with only a few mentions of the unfortunate series of accidents that had befallen his charitable works. The screen displays the ornate Winslow family mausoleum, an imposing structure of marble and granite. Surviving her husband by only 4 months, Eleanor Winslow succumbed to what was described as nervous exhaustion in February 1913. Their children, Frederick, Victoria, and Charles, inherited one of the largest fortunes in America. Within a year, all 3 had left the United States, relocating to Europe just months before the outbreak of World War I. Photographs appear showing the Winslow children in European settings. Frederick in London, Victoria in Paris, Charles in Switzerland. The Winslow siblings never returned to America. Across Europe, they lived out their lives in luxury, maintaining their distance from the country where their family had built and lost its reputation. None of them ever married or had children. The last surviving sibling, Victoria, died in Geneva in 1972 at the age of 89, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. The scene returns to Dr. Holbrook in her living room. The most unsettling aspect of this case is not just the disappearance of the children, she says, but the meticulous effort that went into erasing them from history. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to remove these children from records that should have been stored in multiple locations. This wasn't just negligence or poor record keeping. This was deliberate and systematic. The camera transitions to modern-day shots of the sites where the Winslow orphanages once stood. Some are now parks. Others have been redeveloped with new buildings. A few remain abandoned. In 2018, archaeological excavations began at the site of the original Winslow Orphanage in Millfield. The narrator explains, what researchers found beneath the ruins sent shock waves through the historical and forensic communities. The scene shows an archaeological dig in progress with researchers carefully excavating an area behind what would have been the orphanage's main building. Dr. Thomas Wright, forensic archaeologist, University of Massachusetts, appears on screen. We weren't expecting to find much, Dr. Wright explains, standing at the edge of the excavation. Our ground-penetrating radar had shown some structural anomalies beneath what would have been the courtyard area. So, we were initially looking for architectural features not shown on the original plans. What we found instead were human remains. The camera shows carefully marked excavation units with researchers meticulously documenting their findings. To date, we've recovered the remains of 47 individuals from this site alone. Dr. Wright continues, his expression grave. All children ranging in age from approximately 3 to 16 years. Most disturbing is that many show evidence of surgical procedures that have no therapeutic purpose. We can identify precise incisions on the skull and spine. Evidence of tissue and organ removal. Strange modifications to the long bones. These weren't medical treatments. They were something else entirely. The camera pans across laboratory tables where researchers examine small bones with painstaking care. A new expert is introduced, Dr. Sarah Keller, forensic anthropologist. What's most unsettling is the precision of the modifications to these remains, Dr. Keller explains, pointing to specific features visible under magnification. These weren't crude procedures. They were performed with sophisticated tools and considerable anatomical knowledge. Some of the techniques appear to have been experimental in nature, testing different approaches, different methods of accessing certain areas of the body. She pauses, clearly disturbed by her own findings. Based on the evidence, these children didn't die of natural causes. They were subjected to systematic procedures that no legitimate medical practice would justify, especially on children. The scene transitions to Detective Torres at the police station. Following the discoveries in Millfield, we obtained warrants to investigate the sites of 3 other former Winslow orphanages, he explains. At each location, we found similar remains, though in varying numbers. We're dealing with what appears to be one of the largest cases of organized child murder in American history. The camera shows investigators at multiple sites, the grim work of recovery continuing. But the question remains, why? The narrator asks as the scene shifts to a university library where researchers pore over old documents. What purpose could possibly explain such systematic abuse and murder of children? The answer may lie in understanding the other activities of the Winslow family during this period. A new expert appears on screen, Dr. William Foster, historian of science and medicine, Johns Hopkins University. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a pivotal time in medical research. Dr. Foster explains, germ theory was relatively new. Transplant surgery was in its infancy. Understanding of human development and neurology was primitive by today's standards, and the ethical frameworks that govern medical research today simply didn't exist. He gestures to medical textbooks and journals from the era. What we do know is that Theodore Winslow, despite his public persona as a businessman and philanthropist, had a deep interest in medical research. He donated extensively to medical schools and research institutes. And most tellingly, in 1895, 2 years before opening his first orphanage, he established the Winslow Institute for Advanced Biological Studies, a private research facility staffed by physicians and scientists recruited from around the world. The camera shows photographs of an elegant stone building surrounded by manicured grounds with a group of serious-looking men in formal attire standing on its steps. The Winslow Institute operated with virtually no oversight. Dr. Foster continues, its work was never published in mainstream medical journals. Its researchers never participated in scientific conferences, yet it consumed enormous amounts of funding and employed dozens of specialists who effectively disappeared from the scientific community once they joined the institute. The scene transitions back to Dr. Holbrook. When you put these pieces together, the orphanage is collecting thousands of children, the disappearance of those children, the Winslow Institute conducting secretive research, and now the discovery of remains showing evidence of surgical experimentation. A horrifying picture emerges, she says. These orphanages weren't charitable institutions. They were providing human subjects for experimentation on an industrial scale. The music grows more somber as the camera pans across photographs of the orphan children. Their faces solemn, their fates now becoming clear. But even this grim conclusion doesn't explain the full scope of what we found, the narrator continues. The number of remains discovered at the orphanage sites accounts for only a small percentage of the children who disappeared. What happened to the rest? The scene shifts to another expert, Dr. Rebecca Cohen, medical historian, Yale University. There's a disturbing possibility that emerges from the fragmentary records we've managed to recover from the Winslow Institute. Dr. Cohen explains, it appears they were particularly interested in tissue compatibility and rejection, fundamental concepts in transplant medicine, but decades before the first successful human organ transplants were performed. She gestures to diagrams and notes recovered from the Institute's archives. The patterns we're seeing suggest they were conducting extensive testing to identify compatible donors among the orphanage children, essentially treating them as a living tissue bank. The most disturbing implication is that they may have been harvesting organs and tissues for transplantation into wealthy patients. The camera zooms in on a partial document that mentions successful integration of donor tissue and extended survival of recipient. The technology for successful organ transplantation didn't exist at that time, Dr. Cohen continues. But that doesn't mean they weren't trying. And given the resources at their disposal, they may have made advances that weren't shared with the wider medical community. Built on unthinkable suffering, these advances. The scene transitions to show elegant homes and social gatherings of the wealthy elite of the early 1900s. During this same period, the Winslow social circle included some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in America and Europe. The narrator explains, aging industrialists, aristocrats with family fortunes, politicians at the twilight of their careers, many of whom would have had a keen interest in extending their lives or treating conditions that medicine of the day couldn't address. The camera pans across. Photographs of lavish parties at the Winslow estate, the guests elderly but expensively dressed, their expressions suggesting privilege and entitlement. Records indicate that the Winslow Institute maintained private treatment rooms in a separate wing. The narrator continues, visitors would arrive discreetly, stay for periods ranging from days to weeks, and leave with no public record of their visit. Among the Institute's visitors were at least 3 senators, a governor, several European nobles, and numerous business leaders, all aging, all wealthy, all willing to pay handsomely for treatments they couldn't receive elsewhere. Detective Torres appears again, looking troubled. We found financial records suggesting payments to the Winslow Foundation that far exceed normal charitable donations, he explains. Some individuals made contributions of what would today be millions of dollars, often coinciding with their visits to the Institute. These weren't donations. They were payments for services rendered. The scene shows researchers examining ledgers and financial documents. The scale of this operation was extraordinary, the narrator says. Thousands of children processed through the orphanages. Hundreds of staff members involved at various levels. Dozens of wealthy clients receiving experimental treatments. All of it hidden behind a facade of philanthropy that fooled an entire nation for 15 years. Dr. Holbrook returns to the screen. What makes this case so important to understand beyond the sheer horror of it is how it illuminates the darkest possibilities of wealth and power operating without accountability. She says the Winslows created a system where children, society's most vulnerable members, could be exploited, experimented upon, and disposed of without consequence. And they nearly got away with it completely. The camera returns to the archaeological excavation in Millfield, where work continues as researchers uncover more remains. In 2023, the investigation expanded to include the grounds of the former Winslow estate, the narrator explains. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, investigators identified multiple areas of interest across the 200-acre property. The screen shows teams working methodically across wooded grounds, marking areas for excavation. What they found suggests that the estate itself may have been the final destination for many of the missing children. The narrator continues as the camera shows forensic teams carefully excavating a large area. To date, investigators have recovered the remains of over 300 individuals buried in unmarked graves on the property, most of them children, but also including adults who may have been orphanage staff members. Detective Torres appears again, standing at the edge of the excavation site. This is now officially the largest mass grave discovered in modern American history, he says, his voice tight with controlled emotion. And based on the radar surveys, we've only excavated about 20% of the potential burial areas on the property. The final count could be in the thousands. The scene transitions to a laboratory where researchers examine recovered artifacts, small personal items found with the remains. A new expert is introduced, Dr. Jennifer Oakes, forensic scientist. We're finding personal effects with some of the remains, hair clips, buttons, occasionally jewelry, or religious medals, Dr. Oakes explains, showing several small items carefully preserved in evidence containers. We're hoping these might help us identify some of the victims, especially when combined with DNA analysis and the detailed intake records from the orphanages. The camera shows a team working with computers and laboratory equipment. The identification effort is the largest of its kind ever undertaken, the narrator explains. Using advanced DNA techniques, researchers are attempting to match the remains with potential descendants of the missing children's families. A challenging task given that most of these children were orphans with few known relatives. The scene shifts to Catherine Reeves, the genealogist who first began investigating the disappearances. Every child who went into those orphanages had a history, had a family somewhere, she says, the emotion evident in her voice. Even if their parents were dead, many had siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles who lost track of them. Each one of these children represents a branch of a family tree that was violently cut short. By identifying them, we're not just solving a historical mystery. We're restoring connections that were severed a century ago. The camera shows a wall of photographs, the intake photos of children from the Winslow orphanages. Their faces solemn, their futures unknown. To date, 17 sets of remains have been positively identified through DNA matching with descendants of their families. The narrator says. Among them was William Reeves, Catherine's great-grandfather, whose remains were recovered from the Winslow estate in 2024, 121 years after he entered the orphanage system. The scene returns to the present day, showing the former Winslow estate now transformed into a memorial site. Simple stone markers stand in rows, each representing a recovered individual. Visitors walk slowly between them, some leaving flowers or small tokens. The investigation continues both into the forensic evidence and the historical record, the narrator explains. Many questions remain unanswered. How many people knew what was happening? How did the Winslows maintain secrecy on such a scale? Did their children continue similar practices in Europe after fleeing America? Dr. Holbrook appears one final time. The Winslow case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth, power, and what humans are capable of doing to one another. She says, it's easy to distance ourselves from this horror by thinking it happened in a different time, under different circumstances, but the conditions that made it possible, extreme wealth concentration, vulnerable populations with few protections, and influential people who believe their desires outweigh others' humanity. Those conditions haven't disappeared. The camera pans slowly across the memorial site as twilight falls, the markers casting long shadows. The story of the Winslow orphanages isn't just a historical mystery, the narrator concludes. It's a warning about what can happen when we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. The children who disappeared into this system deserved better than to become nameless subjects in a wealthy family's experiments. They deserve to be children, to grow up, to live their lives. At the very least, they deserve to be remembered. The screen shows a single candle being lit beside one of the markers. As darkness falls, the search for answers continues. The identification efforts go on, and slowly, name by name, the children of the Winslow orphanages are being found at last. Not alive as their families might have hoped, but at least no longer lost to history. The camera pulls back to show hundreds of candles now lit across the memorial site. Points of light in the gathering darkness. As the screen fades to black, a final text appears. Between 1897 and 1912, an estimated 3,000 children disappeared through the Winslow orphanage system. To date, 682 sets of remains have been recovered with excavations continuing. The Winslow case remains the largest unresolved mass disappearance in American